All right, thank you all very much for coming along today. As we were introduced, my name's Josh and Megan, but we do have to give a big shout out also to David and Pierre, who are out there somewhere in the audience. So feel free to go and hassle them as well and ask them lots and lots of questions about cloud forensics as well. So we wanted to put together a bit of content to kind of help people and to kind of give them something to take away if they have to do investigations in the cloud. One of the biggest challenges I know that I kind of find when working with clients or when working with victims of incidents is that often you kind of go, all right, like what infrastructure have you got? And they're like, all right, we've got Microsoft 365, or we've got AWS, or we've got Google Cloud. It's like, all right, cool. Have you turned on logs, or what is turned on or what's not turned on? They're like, turned on logs? What is that? So hopefully today we'll give you something to take away in terms of understanding what is turned on by default and what is not turned on by default, and how you can potentially extend the life of the evidence that you have sitting up inside of your cloud platforms. Now, we're going to very much try to take this fast because there's a lot of content to cover. So feel free to ask questions as we kind of come off. I think we're going to leave 5 minutes towards the end, but if there's more questions, hit us up in Slack. So as we kind of introduced, my name's Josh Lemon. I also work for a company called Ankura, which is an international consulting company, and I look after their digital forensics and IR team out in Asia Pacific. So yes, if my accent sounds a little unusual, it's probably now a mix of Australian and American and a little bit of British all mixed together now. But outside of that, I'm also a co-author with SANS, so I look after the cloud class and also the DFIR Net Wars class as well. With I think Ladrina's here as well, so make sure you hit her up and say hello. And then I also teach the 508, 572 and the 509 class as well.
My name is Megan Roddy. I work at a small company you might have heard of called IBM as a senior security engineer with X-Force. I'm based out of Austin here, so I'm very happy to have us here in my hometown. I love coming to the DFIR Summit. Not a far trip and a great time. I'm also one of the co-authors of SANS Forensic 509. I'm focused on Google Workspace, our labs. So if you're taking that course this week, you have a feedback, for sure, let me know. And it'd be remiss of me not to use this opportunity to give a shout out to my nonprofit, Mental Health Hackers, the CFO over there. We're doing great work trying to bring mental health awareness to the industry. So go check that out if you get the opportunity.
Okay, let's have a look at some of the stuff that we've got. So common question is, we're using the cloud. What happens if we have an incident there? Well, it really depends a little bit too, and also depends on which cloud you're using. Now, today, in the space of just over 30 minutes left, we're going to try and really rapidly run you through AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, M365, and also Google Workspace. Now, understand this is all compressed into a space of sort of 35 minutes. So yes, there are things we're going to have to gloss over. And yes, there are things we're going to have to assume as part of it. But we want to try to give you enough information to kind of make you curious and to go and look at these things inside of your own environment. Okay, so let's see how far we can get in 35 minutes. So to start off with, big thing to understand with the cloud platform, your evidence source, or at least your primary evidence source, is going to be logs. Unlike if you've taken the Forensics 508 class or the 500 classes where you get disk images or you get memory images, inside of the cloud, your primary forensic source is logs. It's not your only forensic source, but that is the evidence source that you have to get comfortable with. And it changes depending on what type of service you're actually using inside of the cloud. Now, if you're using infrastructure as a service, and that's your virtual machines inside of the cloud, you actually have quite a lot of logs, which is really good. Like if you're using those virtual machines, lots of logs sitting there for you to use and to go and consume. But if you're using things like Kubernetes or containers inside of that platform as a service, the logs start to diminish in terms of how much logs you actually have access to inside of the cloud platforms. And then even when you start to move up to things like software as a service, the log sources again start to diminish, or at least they start to get limited based on what the vendor is going to actually provide you. And you'll see in a minute, particularly in that SaaS space, that it changes quite a lot between things like M365 and Google Workspace as well. And you are really very much in the hands of the vendor of what they're going to hand over to you to allow you to do some type of investigation. So quick takeaway here, you've got infrastructure as a service, you've got a lot of logs behind it. If you're in that software as a service platform, you have to engage with the vendor and understand what they're going to give you by default, but also what is it that you can call upon them for in the time that you actually do have a big incident. The other thing to understand too, just from a conceptual background with logs inside of the cloud platforms, we kind of break these down into sort of 5 broad categories. Now, we've kind of broken them into 5 broad categories to make them best fit. And also we've kind of broken this down from top to bottom to also kind of show you what things you should start to look at to begin with when it comes to a cloud investigation. So to start with, you've got identity and access management. Almost everything in the cloud has some type of authentication tied to it. So start there. That is the best place to start when it comes to doing an investigation. We then have platform-based logs as well. They're the logs that say that Megan interacted with a different API inside of the cloud, or Megan tried to look at something specific inside of the cloud. They're the things that tell us what a user is doing as they move around inside of that cloud platform. Then we have our resource management logs. And pretty much the top 3 here are, in most cases, with like a big asterisk at the end of it, turned on by default in most cases. And the resource management ones tell me what resources someone has spun up. So did Megan create a virtual machine? Did she spin up an S3 bucket to store data inside of it? So that tells me what has occurred with the resources. Now, the 4th one here, this is where things start to get a bit gray. And whether these are turned on or off by default depends on the platform, and sometimes depends on whether you've turned them off. And in some unusual cases, depends on when you created your tenancy as well. So resource logs are really based around the actions that a resource takes. So for example, if we have AWS and Megan spun up an S3 bucket, she would get a resource management log to say that new S3 bucket was created by Megan. But if she started to do things like put files inside of that bucket, these are logs that are based around what is occurring inside the bucket itself. And we consider these resource logs, that 4th one from the top. Now, in a lot of cases, as I said, they're off by default. So you have to go and turn those on. Then the one right down the bottom there, application logs, really applies to virtual machines or applications running inside of the cloud and sucking those logs out as well. Again, it varies depending on cloud platform as to whether they're on or off by default. Again, the takeaway here is that these are the sort of the 5 categories we try to sort of put logs into across all the cloud platforms to make some sort of standard or make them understandable for most people across all the platforms. Now, the next thing that people kind of go to is they go, all right, let's get these logs out of the platforms. Josh and Megan told us about all these cool logs. We can go and investigate them. Let's dump them into something and see prettiness. Let's go and see these pretty dashboards and we'll just see evil pop out all of a sudden. This is a lot of what people expect to see from investigating a cloud environment. The reality of what you often see though is more like this. These are raw logs out of the platform. They don't come out pretty. They don't come out with lovely graphics by default. This is more of what you actually get out of that cloud platform. And this is an example from Microsoft's platform as part of it. So how do we get this into something that looks like that pretty graphic that we saw here? Well, a lot of the time we have to basically take those logs and then convert them, enrich them, and transpose them into something useful. So a lot of the times you have to take the logs, you parse them out, you then do enrichment with them. So we can do things like GeoIP lookup, that's a pretty common one, and then start to ingest them into some sort of log aggregation platform. And this can be anything. This can be your Elk Stack, this can be Splunk, this can be Graylog, this can be SumoLogic, you kind of take your pick. But you have to ingest them into something to do something with them as well. And this still falls part of incident response and forensics within the cloud, because you might get called upon to look at M365 today, and then you might get called upon to look at Google Cloud tomorrow. And trying to find somewhere that can ingest this data quickly is really the hard part. Now, as part of the 509 class, we kind of debated about this quite a lot. And in the end, we ended up picking SoftElk, which is basically a virtual machine. It takes the Elastic Stack and has had some amazing things wrapped around it. So a big shout out to Phil Hagen, who basically kicked this off a couple of years ago. And it's kind of exploded from there, where we've done things like create new rules for ingesting different types of logs and also slowly adding new dashboards to it. Now, if you haven't seen SoftElk before, I won't spend too long on it, but go and take a look at it, and we'll give you a link at the end so you can basically go and have a look and download it. But it's a virtual machine with a pre-configured version of Elastic Kibana and Logstash to ingest logs. And this is exactly what we actually teach people in the 509 class. So it's something that is approachable by most people. All right, let's start to talk about some of the platforms. We'll start with M365. Now, as I said before, this is going to be fast, so understand there's lots of edge cases here. M365, by default, who thinks the logs are turned on by default? A show of hands in the room. Oh, one. Okay. Who thinks they're off by default? Okay, for those online, that's probably a little bit over half. Who thinks it's grayer than that? Who thinks there's no clear answer? Okay, and that's about half the room. And you would be correct. There is no clear answer. So let me try and clear some of that up for you. Now, depending on when you created your tenancy really depends on whether logs are on or off by default. If you created an M365 tenancy after October last year, the logs are on by default. So thumbs up for those of you who have a tenancy after October last year. If it was created before October last year, the official line is they're off by default at the moment. But Microsoft are slowly trying to turn them back on for people. Now, this varies, and in practice, it really does vary. I looked at a victim's case, I think it was a week ago before I flew over here, and they had a tenancy pre-October, and they were off by default. So there are still people in this state of logs off by default in M365. So if you have an M365, go and have a look and see whether your logs are on or off by default. And you would do that inside the Compliance Manager. The other part to M365 is you have what's called the Unified Audit Log, or the UAL. And this is where all the logs are tipped into. So if you have Exchange Online, the logs are in here. If you have SharePoint, logs are in here. If you have OneDrive, all the logs are here for you. And they include both administrative actions and user actions. So this is your key resource or your key piece of evidence if you want to investigate an M365 instance. But depends on whether it's on or off by default, which is tough. Okay. Now, the other thing to be aware of as well is that the logs aren't always thrown into the UAL buckets instantly. There is a delay on those logs going in there. So they can be delayed by up to 30 minutes for most services in M365. Now you might kind of go, well, 30 minutes, oh my gosh. So if the threat actor's in there for 30 minutes, I'm not going to see that activity. Well, yes, true. But understand 30 minutes in the space of Microsoft, who have this huge cloud with a bunch of customers sitting on it, is pretty good. It's pretty fair. But you do have to understand that if I pull the logs down right now, there's a 30-minute lag that I might not see data for. Now it gets a little bit worse. The Azure AD logs that get thrown into the UAL can take up to a day to get in there, which is not great. But there are other places you can go and get these, the Azure AD logs, which we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, so it could be a delay by up to 30 minutes. Not too bad, but just something to be aware of. The other thing to be aware of is depends on your license type will depend on how long the logs are kept for. So if you have an E5 license, which is like the premium license in M365, you've got a year's worth of logs being held for you as part of what you already pay for M365. If you've got anything under an E5 as an enterprise license, you've got 90 days. And then the numbers get lower again for things like standard business. They can go down to even less days as part of that as well. So the big thing you have to do here is try to get those logs out so you can start to investigate them as quickly as possible. So a big part of what we try to teach in the 509 class is how to get those logs out so you can actually hold them and then manipulate them and do something with them as well. So go and grab those logs quickly. Make sure they're turned on for M365 to start with. That's probably your other big thing to kind of watch as part of it. Alrighty, that's enough on M365.
Over to my bread and butter, Google Workspace. So again, there's gonna be multiple ways to get these logs. The thing with getting the logs from Google Workspace, I've always been very frustrated with their admin portal. As a responder, I love my single pane of glass. I love to be able to get all the logs, one view, and then start my filtering down from everything to the activity I'm interested in. Unfortunately, the Workspace admin portal, when you want to go to logs, you're given an investigation tool, which I'll show in a few, but they're divided up by your category. So I can't look at the drive logs as they appear within the order of time with the login logs, as they appear with email activity. I have to drive into each separate log. You do get to use Google's compute power, their filtering engine, which again, we'll see in their investigation tool. But in order to do that, you have to do it from their UI with the information they provide as they provide it. You also, they recently, when they moved to their new investigation tool, they want you to download it in Google Sheets. Obviously, a lot of us are not working with Google Sheets. We're working with Excel. We're working with CSV, JSON, that kind of format. So you have to download a Google Sheets, export to CSV. For that reason, when I pull logs from Google, I prefer to go through the API. It allows for faster collection because I can use automation. I can use scripts. There's a talk tomorrow that will release another open source tool for gathering logs via API. I'll provide in the resource section, the GitHub for our course, which also includes our scripts, all allowing for easy connection. One of the other big things, the differences in these two log collection activities is the timestamps. Unfortunately, in the admin portal, you're gonna get the timestamps in the local admin time. Local user time. That is great if all of your users, all of your staff, all of your responders all work from the same time zone, all realize you're working in that time zone. Right now, we have remote work. Many of you probably work with colleagues in other time zones. So exporting those sheets, there's now additional communication to occur. Is this UTC? Is this your time zone? Is this my time zone? To get it all straight. API keeps it simple. Everything in UTC, often what us responders are working off of in order to mitigate those issues with working across time zones. In terms of event extraction, when you export in the admin interface, it's going to cap your results. Obviously, you're exporting a spreadsheet. They're not going to give you millions and millions of lines in a spreadsheet. So depending on where in the admin interface, the tool you're pulling from, you're either going to get a cap of about 10K or 100,000 records. That may be fine if you're a small business. If you're an enterprise, you could quickly exceed that limit. API, as long as Workspace has retained those logs, which we'll go into those retention limits here in a second, then you'll be able to pull all those back. Of course, speaking of APIs, some of you who are not as familiar with computing concepts such as that may not have the experience of working with an API. There is more of a learning curve. You do need to set up an application within the API console. A lot of people find this overwhelming. There's additional setup, configuration of a developer portal. But another thing that I advertise about this method of going of it is sometimes the option is that creating this application token that can quickly be revoked, or the lazy sysadmin saying, oh, my responders need logs. Here's a super admin account with a shared password that I'm going to email them. So while it may sound overwhelming, may sound like this extra step, this extra account creation, it's often actually the shorter route, the more secure route to giving keys to the kingdom in order to get logs. And like we said before, instead of getting a spreadsheet or even worse, a proprietary Google Sheet format, we're going to get that JSON format. JSON is great because that structured data is exactly what we need to pipe into the log enrichment, parsing, etc. pipeline that Josh explained. Getting that structured data, enriching it, transforming it, and displaying it in our platform of choice. Most SIMs, most log aggregators, most processing tools are going to accept JSON. So it's yet another reason to use the API. Again, it comes down to your use case. If you just quickly have a question to answer of, did this user look at this file? maybe the investigation tool is your way to go. But it's important to understand that there are multiple methods of getting this data, and you need to determine what your use case is and how you should approach getting the data. So as I mentioned, Google, in order to expose their logs, their workspace logs in the UI, they recently released this investigation tool. I believe it was around February that we started seeing the rollout and the documentation from our spot checking across our different test organizations. It seems that most of this has been rolled out now. So you're likely going to see this investigation tool as opposed to the old reporting interface. As you can see on the search menu on the right, I have selected in the example drive log events. This is what I was talking about of I don't have a single pane of view. There is no all log selection there. You must choose your event source and then you can filter on your conditions. Filtering on conditions, like I said, if you have an investigation and all you're trying to answer is a quick question, hey, did this user edit this file? I can tell you that very quickly with the investigation tool. I'm not going to pull 10,000 logs via JSON, export them, put them into a SIM just to tell you whether a user looked at a file. In that case, this will work perfect for you. I go to my drive logs, I do a condition, I set it up. Another cool thing to note about the investigation tool is if you're setting up detections, they'll actually let you create alerts based on your results. So you'll see to the right of search one, it's a bit small text, but you're able to see it to the right of the search box. It says create activity rule. So if I not only want to know, did a user look at this file, but want to be alerted in future, if users ever show me that file, this is the way I can go about doing it. So the investigation tool, while limited in its ability to mass produce thousands of enterprise logs for large forensic investigations, may not be the way to go. It's good to know about this tool because you will have that use case where a few hundred logs via the investigation tool is the way to go. So that's that screenshot. You can find that. You can go through any log type, filter on basically any field that's supported. I will say the new investigation tool ended up working, providing a lot more data than the old audit logs did. One of the things I used to advertise in a sense, when I would discuss should you pull via API or via Sheets, I found I could get a lot more data and context via the API. But luckily, Google has closed that gap with their new investigation tool and has surfaced a lot of the fields that previously were kept as their own dedicated JSON fields, not exposed in the UI. So worth looking into if you need to quickly spot check logs. You can export, you can save your searches. So this is a good source to use for logs if you're doing quick question answering investigations. Going into the retention, the lag time, we discussed with Microsoft, a lot of the licensing is either 30 minutes or an hour, depending on log type. It's similar with Google Workspace. Your retention, your lag times, it's all going to depend on the type of logs you're looking at. You're looking at your admin audit logs, your admin activities, people changing settings to your tenancy. You're going to see a 6-month retention, and that's going to be kind of common across all the log types. 6 months is a great retention period. Like we saw before, 30 days is very common. Sometimes we'll see 90 days. Those are the more common default log retention times, regardless of application or source or vendor. So 6 months, relatively generous for a vendor. Admin audit logs, login audit logs, user audit logs, security reports, all of those 6 months. Where we differ is the lag time, although we still consider it pretty good SLA for a vendor. With your admin audit logs, those are going to be within the portal within a few minutes. And then within tens of minutes, you're going to see user account audit logs. That's going to be things like I updated my recovery account email, I disabled 2FA, I added a recovery phone number, those types of activities within tens of minutes. Where they're going to move into every few hours is going to be the lag time for the login audit logs. It's unfortunate, again, that 30 minutes for Microsoft, kind of similar. Yes, if you're responding to an incident or investigating something that occurred within the last 30 minutes, unfortunate, but If you're a responder in this room, if you've done incident response before, you know you're very lucky if you are catching an incident within the first 30 minutes of investigation. So for me, that lag time of a few hours is likely not going to impact you in a large number of cases, but it's always good to be aware. That's the purpose of this talk, being aware of what data is there and what is not. So if you are looking for activity within the first few hours, you might have to go back. This was very annoying as a lab developer for the course, trying to generate logs. I would have to run my scenario, walk away for a few hours, and then come back and hope my logs appeared from the activity I did. And then at the longer end of the lag time, we see these security reports coming in with 1 to 3 days, which you see the word security, you see this long lag time is kind of concerning. But you have to keep in mind that this is Google's security engine doing their little magic of their analysis, their assessment of activity over time. They have to run their stuff through engines. So this is not necessarily surprising that there is a few days lag time. Just due to the nature of the data you're finding, it does require time to accrue. And then one last thing worth mentioning, we talked about the API and the UI as ways to get logs. Because of the integrated nature of Google's environment, if you are both a Google Workspace and a Google Cloud Platform user, they have created an easy button to enable log sharing between Google Workspace and Google Cloud. Perfect, great. Only problem, they are very selective about what logs you get. You either get the ones that they offer or you get none, and there's no in between. So for example, you'll see here, you get the big ones, you get the admin activity, the log and audit logs, OAuth logs. All of those are going to be super useful in investigations. But for me, when I'm investigating in Google Workspace, a lot of the times I'm investigating BECs. Well, BECs aren't great to investigate without the email logs, which are not enabled via Google Cloud Shipping. I don't have Drive logs. So if I'm looking for activity within Google Drive or Google Chat, I don't have those logs. So again, it's that concept of visibility. It's great. Enable it if you use Google Cloud for logging. You might as well have the logs backed up there. But if you're going there expecting to have all the data you need for an investigation, it is not going to be there. So it's another one of those things. Keep in mind what you do and do not have when you're going to a specific source. With that, I'll hand it back to Josh.
Cool. All right. So Azure Cloud Logs. Now, again, back in the space of Microsoft, who can chop and change a little bit with the logs that they have turned on and turned off. Now, we've already talked about M365, and you have to, in your mind, kind of separate, although that's Microsoft, that is kind of a platform on its own. That's Microsoft's SaaS platform, their software as a service. What I want to talk about quickly is Azure, which is their infrastructure and also part of their platform as a service as well. This is where we run virtual machines, where I get storage, where I can drop buckets and data of files into, but this is their infrastructure side of the house now. Now, over in Azure Cloud, we have a couple of different log sources. In this case, though, the tenancy and subscription log sources, which are their correct names in Azure, are on by default. So tenancy allows me to see things like Azure AD or Active Directory inside of Azure. And these are things like my logging events. Now, this is a separate log source to the UAL, which I talked about a moment ago. So when I said that the Azure logs inside the UAL are delayed by up to a day, over here in the tenancy logs, they are much faster. You can actually go and pull them over here. The other really cool thing from an investigator's point of view is understand that if the UAL logs are off inside of someone's M365, often you still have the tenancy logs for authentication events turned on by default. Now, again, this varies by license type as well. It can be as small as 7 days worth of history. It can be as large as 1 year's worth of history, again, depending on licensing type. But a really good place to go looking for authentication events is over in Azure, inside the Azure AD logs as part of it. We also have things like the subscription logs inside of Azure, and they're things like actions that have occurred inside of Azure. So when someone creates a new virtual machine, I get that inside of my subscription logs. Now, there are 3 other log sources that we've mentioned here. They're things like resources, operating system, and application logs. They are off by default. So if I want things like flow data for network traffic, off by default, it's considered a resource log. You have to go and turn it on. If I want to do things like suck out my IIS web server logs from a virtual machine, which you can do inside of Azure, which is really quite clever, they're considered application logs off by default. You have to go and turn those on specifically. But you do have tenancy and subscription logs there. Now, I'm not going to go through which license types have different ones because it changes a little bit for Azure as well, but understand that there is a short time frame on those logs, and we'll talk about how to extend those. So in this example here, this is looking at the tenancy logs. This is going and looking at my authentication logs. So inside of here, I get 30 days worth of history of those authentication logs that I can go back and see. Now, 30 days isn't very long. Like if I want to go and see what a threat actor has potentially been doing, 30 days doesn't give me a long time to go backwards in time to actually look to see what has occurred inside of an environment. So there's often this need to want to extend the lifetime of these. Now, there's a number of ways you can do this, but one thing that we kind of want to show you is how you can use the platform itself, because the idea is for you to take something back so you can do it inside of your own environment or inside of your customers' environments. Inside the diagnostic settings, under the Azure tenancy component, you can go and extend the life, or you can go and save these logs into a storage account. And this allows you to now dump those logs in JSON format using the built-in storage platform inside of Azure. And I can go and extend this for however long I want. In this example here, it's 180 days. And what it will do is it will automatically rotate those logs after 180 days for me, all in the background. Now, the reality is I could turn this on and forget about it. I could turn this on and just go and use it when I have an incident. And this is really what a lot of people should be trying to do. Yes, you're going to pay for the log storage costs. So just be aware there is an additional cost component to it. But the fact that you can extend from 7 days when you have the standard business license, or even 30 days from the enterprise license out to 180 or even longer is a pretty good win for us as investigators. Alrighty, let's look at AWS.
When it comes to AWS, we're going to focus in this talk on CloudTrail. That's our primary source of logging. There are, of course, other log sources, other content in AWS we could dive into to get data for investigations. And 4509 will teach you that if you want to get into lots of details on lots of different logging sources. But to focus on CloudTrail, as it's created by default, which we love having stuff on by default. It's also retained for 90 days free. Again, in the scope of how long things can be retained, we just talked about, 7-day and 30-day defaults. 90 days is pretty good. And the good thing about CloudTrail is that the way it works is every API call is logged as an event. So all your interactions with your AWS workspace, regardless of the application, regardless of whether it is interactions with your S3 buckets or with your EC2 instances, everything's going to be logged in those CloudTrails. There's even the maximum SLA for CloudTrail records is 15 minutes. Again, very good. Most records will be available in less than 5 minutes. So you'll get these logs pretty quick. It's a pretty quick turnaround on getting those logs. Even better is just like we talked about Azure, saving off those logs into a separate storage instance. With CloudTrail, we can configure to retain logs in S3. Once again, you are going to pay for it. Storage just costs money, but it's cloud storage. In the scope of things, the value you get for the logs you're storing is worth the cost. It's relatively cheap depending on the scale of your logging. So back those up, get them in S3. Again, 90 days is great, but if we're talking about APTs, someone who's been in the system for 6 months, a year, slowly making their way through your network, that 90 days is going to cut off a lot of evidence. Throw them in a bucket. Worst comes to worst, you need them, you grab them later. In terms of searching the logs, if you don't want to grab those raw logs and look at the raw log content, which we will teach you to get into SOF-ELK in 4509, which we do have a parser for, you can use AWS provided services. There's the CloudTrail portal, which, like all of the other logging we've talked about, there is a portal. You can log in, you can filter, you can export. There's also AWS provided services, Athena, Detective, Glue, all services you can dive into more, various costs depending. Again, cloud costs, so typically charged at a very cheap level. At scale, it starts to build, but to start off, you've got a good method of evaluating logs on the cheap. And then along with the internal methods of analyzing the internal S3 shipping, CloudTrail portals. Once again, there are ways via the API, via the configurations to get these logs to your preferred destination if you do have a SIM configured or even just a simple log aggregator. Here's just an example of that UI I talked about for searching CloudTrail logs. So there's filters. It's going to show you the last 90 days, that default 90-day retention. It's worth noting that the download events is going to download your current view. A lot of people will want to come in here quick. Oh, download events. That's what I need. Get my logs, get them exported. But it's going to download what you have filtered. And obviously, there's these default filters in place. So if you do want to get that full 90 days of logs, you're going to want to click that custom time range, expand out all the way, remove all your filters and see it. Once again, there are use cases in which CloudTrail is enough for you. You just need to find a specific event or a specific user's activity, download those events from a time frame. So there is this simple view. You can pivot over to Athena. You can export into spreadsheets. You can export into your SIM. Wherever your use case is gonna most value having these logs, there is a method to get them there. And then here's just one breakdown of a simple quick log view for you to see what a trail looks like. So this is a trail configured for logging. You can create your own trails. So if you have use cases where you want to segregate out specific API calls or events related to a specific application, you can do that. You'll see there's an S3 path link to a trail log location where these are logged to and all the metadata associated. So any number of trails can be created. Keep an eye on your billing if that's important, making sure that you're not just turning on all the things and now are racking up thousands of dollars of storage costs. But there are these methods to set these up and get these logs saved off, preparing for that incident that may occur.
Okay, over to Google Cloud. Now, Megan talked about before Google Workspace, which again is that SaaS component to Google's infrastructure. This is the Google Cloud, which is their infrastructure component. Now, the logging in here is quite a good story when it comes to, well, what it compares to at least those other ones that we've looked at. Now, the way that Google Cloud have basically enabled logs by default is pretty cool. So on the left-hand side here of this slide, you'll see that there is what's called a required log bucket. Now, these are 5 log types that are turned on by default by Google, and there is no way for you to turn those off. They are held for 400 days for free for every user on Google Cloud, which is kind of amazing. I mean, it is great that Google have kind of gone, all right, you know what, we're going to really invest in this and we're going to enforce people to have these logs on by default. And this is really handy that they do this. This includes things like authentication events into the platform. It includes admin tasks that occur inside the platform. It includes things like even the one down the bottom there is kind of interesting too, the transparency logs. This occurs when if you call Google support and you say, hey, I need a hand with my Google Cloud platform, I need you to enable something or walk me through something. When a Google support staff member does something inside of your platform, it gets logged and held there for 400 days. So you can see actions that have occurred inside there. Really, really handy. They do also have what's called the denied policy events, which are turned on by default. And this is the thing in the middle column there, or the one on the right-hand side of the 2 columns. These are on by default, but you can turn them off, and they're only held for 30 days. Now, these denied audit events occur when someone inside of the Google Cloud platform does something that they're not authorized to do, regardless of whether they're an admin or a standard user. And you get those turned on by default for 30 days as well. On top of this, there's some other really cool things that Google do as well, like give you the ability to go and turn on additional auditing logs as well. Inside of the IAM section of each project, there is the audit logs component down the left-hand side there. And then you can go and basically tick and turn these on. And you can turn them on based on whether their standard users being turned on or whether their admin tasks being turned on as well. The other really nice thing that Google do inside the Google Cloud platform is they give you 50 gigs per month per project for free. So if you can not produce more than 50 gigs worth of logs per project per month, and you're not going to hold the logs for longer than 30 days, it costs you nothing as part of that. Once you go over those limits, either of those, it starts to cost you money. But they're trying to really enable people to try to hold logs and try to be able to investigate things as part of it. Now, 30 days is not huge. Yes, I get that. But they are trying to encourage people to hold logs and to hold this type of data as well, to basically do investigations. The other nice thing is they do give you the ability to search these logs as well, similar to kind of what you saw with the CloudTrail component. The search is a little bit more involved inside of Google Cloud. We can go and search those logs. We see a histogram. We can actually write searches in sort of SQL-like format at the top there, and then get a bunch of detail down the bottom. This is just a view of what that looks like inside there. I won't go into a lot of detail for it, but understand you can go and search those logs inside of there as well. All right, the last thing, which is just around storage for them. Now, Google Cloud holds logs in what they call log buckets by default. You can actually redirect the logs to a couple of other places, but just to start with, you can hold them in what are called log buckets. The bottom bucket that you see on the screen here, which is the _required bucket, it is set to 400 days. You can't change that. That is hard set. Whereas that default bucket on the first line, the _default, it is set to 30 days, and that holds the policy denied events. And this is actually where every event goes if you don't set up another bucket anyway. And it is set to 30 days by default, but you can go and change that. So you can go and make that smaller or larger depending on what you want to do as part of it. Alrighty, now let's talk about some useful resources to give you something to take away.
Yeah, we'll wrap this up before we get manhandled off stage. Instead, just a quick thing. Everything we talked about here goes way more in depth in our now 6-day Enterprise Cloud Forensics and IR course. Is running this week, is running on demand. We've got sessions throughout the rest of the year. Go in, grab that. We have a cert now associated with this course coming out. So very exciting stuff. Go check out that course. The schedule is below it at /schedule. We mentioned a lot of API pulling stuff. We have a lot of scripts to assist you with this, and our resources on GitHub at 4509.com/GitHub, including my tool to pull Google Workspace logs. New, the Google, the Cloud DFIR poster. I created this. I wanted it perfectly scheduled for release here. So if you go out the hall across to the swag tables, you can grab that poster before anyone else has access. If you're not here in person, if you're online, August 18th, just a couple days after our special visitors here get first peek, you'll get to grab a digital copy of that. And then lastly, we mentioned how we use Sawfell as kind of a way to demonstrate log analysis, log processing in our course. And that is also publicly available and free. 4509.com/Sawfell, the machine and all the parsers for all these cloud services.
Yeah, and if you like doing things like writing parsers, go and contribute to that project as well. That is that's open on GitHub, but go and contribute to those parsers. That tool gets better and better as more people add more parsers to it. So really handy tool to go and play with. Alrighty, with that, I think we get to hand over to Q&A and